I drew my son as the story's main character. He experiences two variations of a post-apocalyptic climate disaster survival scenario, two outcomes that hinge on a chance occurrence within a few moments. It was first published as a comic book in 2012, just a few days before Hurricane Sandy blasted the East Coast. In fact, the morning after the storm, our son Crosby stepped out of his tenement on Avenue C to see a police cruiser float by his front door. The comic was well received and nominated for an Eisner Award, which is comics equivalent of an Oscar. A few years ago, I took the opportunity to expand the book into a full graphic novel, and at that point, I added considerably to the fractured drama and romance, which these kind of things are prerequisites for fictional entertainment forms like films, TV, novels, and comics. But I felt uneasy because my apocalyptic story was full of these kind of ubiquitous mainstream pop culture fed mythologies. For instance, survivors traveling by boat between docks moored to the upper floors of still standing buildings that are submerged on the lower floor, sort of like Venice, okay? And they're using generators and they're foraging for canned food. This is like, kind of water world and these various kinds of things that they show in science fiction movies. But in fact, could any New Yorkers actually survive the very real looming disaster that we are allowing to happen? I approached the sustainability think tank Unbuilt Labs with some questions about what the world's greatest city could look like in the near future. Their answers were terrifying. For example, I asked, how high will the oceans rise? And the answer was, over the past 50 years, the sea levels around New York City rose 6 inches. It'll rise that much again in just the next 14 years at least, which will greatly multiply the catastrophic storm surges. Sandy's storm surge was 9 feet. It inundated the subway system and every Manhattan road tunnel but the Holland. A recent study says that by 2050, the tides will flood coastal parts of New York City twice daily and flood other low-lying areas nearby permanently. By the year 2100, the world's glaciers will have melted entirely. Sea rise worldwide will be 5 feet. So you can exponentially kind of figure out how bad the storm surges will be then. It's all exponential. Ocean currents will be drastically altered as the waters simultaneously have increased acidity and lowered oxygen and are suffused with highly toxic algal blooms, really nasty algae. The rows of unreinforced brick buildings that make up 80% of New York City housing are terribly vulnerable to flooding and earthquakes. They rely on each other for stability and would collapse outwardly, starting at the corners of blocks. Chinatown and the Upper East Side are built on soft ground, which might liquefy. The East Village is built on a swamp. That's where we are right now. Under duress, the shoddy tenements like the one I'm sitting in right now would easily pancake down flat. Okay. And New York City also has this thing called the Ramapo Fault. We're sitting right on top of it. A little fault just for us. It quavers through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and it says possibly Connecticut. They're not sure. And that might generate a quake of a magnitude of 6 or 7, which would more than devastate New York City and perhaps destabilize the nearby Indian Point nuclear reactor. Seismic activity wasn't even accounted for in the New York City building code until 1995. Any buildings left standing after all that would be festering with mold. Standing water also breeds mold and mosquitoes, more disease. Warming waters also invite disease-causing Vibrio bacteria, which can seep through open wounds underwater or be ingested by eating contaminated shellfish. But anyway, by then, eating any kind of sea life is going to kill you. Additionally, there's 9 biosafety level 4 labs in the US and 200 level 3s. Federal regulations obscure how many of those actually operate in New York City, but there's definitely one up on a BSL-3 lab on the Upper East Side, and that's one of several labs in the city that specialize in lethal inhalable microbes, and containment can be compromised completely after power loss from even one major hurricane or earthquake. Okay. As for power sources, New York City only requires emergency backup powers like generators for high volume buildings like malls or prisons or places of assembly and high rises with elevators. The rest of us depend on the good sense of our landlord. Generators aren't cheap, so much for poor neighborhoods. Portable standby gasoline and diesel generators are built for emergency short-term use and only run for 1,000 to 2,000 hours in their entire lifetime, and fuel would be in meager supply, to say the least. Solar generators power small devices generally. There are some smaller units that can handle refrigerators and heaters. The solar battery's got to be charged between uses, and the sun is an inconsistent recharger even in the best of times. Repair parts would be hard, if not impossible. Regarding foraging for food, canned, bottled, or otherwise, over half of New York City's food comes through the world's biggest food market, Hunts Point in the Bronx, which sits close to sea level. If it shuts down, New York City runs out of food in 3 days. There's no significant plans to address this. When massive flooding occurs, water and other fluids in non-waterproof containers, i.e. anything with screw caps, snap lids, pull tops, or crimped caps that have been in contact with floodwaters are contaminated, as are rusty, swollen, or frozen cans. Most cans are stamped with their sell-by date and not safe long after that. Sealed pouches of processed meat, poultry, or fish can store for 1.5 years. Dry rice, cured meats like salami, jerky, and dry sausages are good for several years longer. Anyway, all these options are going to definitely be in extremely short supply. The takeaway? It would be advisable to vacate the area. These dreadful predictions might be mitigated if the polar melts are lessened by sensible efforts to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, but these actions must actually be taken instead of being deliberately stopped by climate change deniers. In 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers determined that massive 6-mile-long sea barriers are needed to protect the Hudson River and New York Harbor from storm surges. But some say that's ineffectual and harmful to the local ecosystems, which it probably is. But at any rate, studies informing this effort were defunded by the previous US administration in 2020. Well, this sure pops the bubble on my story. But, and a hopeful thing here, my interaction with Unbuilt Labs points the way towards more fruitful collaborations between scientists and the producers of popular entertainment. In my case, my fiction provided questions for science to address in order to dispel these long-held post-apocalyptic mythologies. In the case of cyberpunk writer William Gibson, his vision of interactive, like digital worlds, actually informed the directions that subsequent scientific development took in terms of the internet and AI and all this other stuff. Director James Cameron's involvement with oceanic technology enriched his blockbuster movies Abyss and Titanic, and his impressive budgets aided the scientists he worked with. In 2012, he actually funded an expedition to dive to the furthest depths of the Mariana Trench, 11,000 meters down. It yielded newly discovered biodiverse species and a molecule that's now being studied as a possible treatment for Alzheimer's. So many more possibilities for collaboration are possible. Entertainment can also inform. And
James,
it comes down to that.
I
Yeah.
want to jump in, mindful of time.
I got one
And
sentence left. The
of
more
course, please
accurately
go ahead.
informed the public is, the better they'll be able to choose the representatives to actually serve their interests. So yeah, that was it.
Nice. So, James, I know you have a lot of wonderful drawings related to post-Europe. Do you want to share them while we take questions from the audience?
Did I not share that? Yeah. Well, there's like, for instance, here's a draw. I mean, this is a drawing of kids hanging out in a rotting building. But what I think is kind of interesting, probably the first comic book I've ever seen that has a bibliography. It's a scientific. I mean, everything in the afterword that was adapted from the Unbuilt Lab stuff is backed up, and so here it is. underneath a funky drawing, you know. Oh yeah, and actually, the most recent book was published by Dark Horse, which is quite a well-known company, but it was released in the middle of COVID, so in America it was it got a little less than I would have liked, but a hardcover just came out in Spain, and it's getting a lot more notice. So, I'm hoping that there'll be more translations, and sometimes other countries are they're a little more open to the science and a little less closed to reality. So there we go.
Are there any questions for James? Oh,
Yes, I have one.
Please.
Yes, Jennifer, please.
So you said in your presentation that it would be very wise for people to get out of New York City. I'm wondering where they should go and where would be, the best places to be living in the 21st century.
Well, that's a good question because I mean, people will go, oh, well, let's go out to the Midwest or go someplace with high elevation. But I mean, out there, you're liable to have, there's plenty of other environmental catastrophes. But I think in the end, there won't be really much of any place to hide. I don't know. That's a whole nother book. You know what I mean? Like, where can we go? To the moon. There you go. Hopefully the moon will be more hospitable, or Mars. But yeah, it's not. We have to deal with it, and when we have a large segment of the population that doesn't even believe it's real, even though it's smacking them in the face, I don't know. It really becomes an issue. That's why I feel like pop culture, people are like being filled with delusions by pop culture that maybe we better like smarten up the pop culture and stop feeding them a lot of crap. Like, tell them really what is actually going to happen. And a lot of people within these media are sensible enough that they would go like, yeah, let's of course you still have to make a story out of it. So I had to have a romance, but you go, wow, how the romance? Well, you better practice birth control, because who's going to want to have a kid in this world? You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like there's so many issues that everything just the chain of stress, isn't it?